He turned 18 and inherited a key to a hole in the ground. What waited inside would rewrite not just his future, but everything he believed about his past. If you've ever felt like you were navigating this world with no one standing behind you, stay with me and hit that subscribe button. This one's yours. The lawyer's office carried the scent of aging paper and expensive, understated disappointment. I knew that smell. Social workers' cubicles had it. Case managers' cramped little rooms had it. But here, the texture was different. This was the smell of money. Even money that had dried up long ago. My social worker, a permanently exhausted woman named Carol, had called the whole thing a formality. Quote 0, she'd said, her voice clinical and flat, like she was reading a label on a jar. You're his next of kin. You have to be there. So there I sat. One day past my 18th birthday. Officially aged out of the state's care. Planted in a leather chair that cost more than everything I owned. And everything I owned fit inside the duffel bag slumped between my feet. The chair exhaled when I shifted. A soft, expensive groan of protest. I felt like I was wearing someone else's life. The suit they'd pulled from the donation bin pinched across my shoulders. A costume for a role nobody asked me to play. 2 years in group homes had done their work on me. 2 years learning the quiet violence of institutional living. I'd learned to shrink, to watch, to expect absolutely nothing. Useful training for a room like this. The lawyer, Arthur Abernathy, looked as old as the volumes lining his shelves. Thin white hair swept across a pink scalp. Glasses that magnified watery pale eyes into something almost amphibian. He didn't offer sympathy, didn't bother with condolences. Just cleared his throat, a dry, papery rasp, and pushed a slim folder across a polished mahogany desk toward me. Mr. Davies, he started. His voice sounded like gravel turning slowly in a spoon. I served as your grandfather, Alistair Davies, legal counsel for over 30 years. His will is, to be blunt, uncomplicated. He opened the folder. One sheet of paper sat inside. It seemed impossibly thin. Too small to hold the sum total of any man's existence. __, quote _4__. He paused. Let that number float between us like a held breath. It wasn't meant as an insult, just arithmetic. I felt nothing. I hadn't seen my grandfather since I was 10. He'd been a ghost to me, a myth, a name printed on a file somewhere. The man who sent me away. The man who for 8 years hadn't written a single letter, hadn't dialed a single number. This pittance felt right. A final, silent confirmation of exactly what I was worth to him. But Abernathy didn't close the folder. Quote _5__, he continued. His tone didn't shift, not even slightly. He reached into a drawer and withdrew a large, yellowed manila envelope, sealed with a thick wax stamp. It looked like it belonged to another century entirely. He slid it across the desk, and it stopped just short of my hands. I had to lean forward to take it. My name was written on the front in a spidery, unfamiliar hand. Leo Davies. He was very specific about this. It was to be given to you only on your 18th birthday, and only after the will was read. I picked it up. It had weight to it, odd lumps beneath the paper. Inside, my fingers found the hard, unyielding outline of a key, and the stiff edges of something folded tight. What is it? The words scraped out of me raw. First time I'd used my voice since walking into that office. Abernathy adjusted his glasses. Quote 8. He leaned back, fingers steepled like a man settling into a prayer he didn't believe in. Something flickered behind those thick lenses. Not pity, something more layered than that. Curiosity, maybe. To be frank, Leo, the land is worthless, undeveloped, rocky, miles from any serviceable road. The county values it at next to nothing for tax purposes. He let that sit between us. It was his only asset that the creditors couldn't or wouldn't touch. Worthless. Just like the cash. A final punchline from a man I could barely remember. My fingers tightened around the envelope. Every instinct I'd sharpened over 18 years in the system screamed the same thing. Take the $1,400. Find the cheapest motel room in the city. Figure out the rest of your life from a bed you're paying for by the week. That was a smart move. The survivor's move. But something wouldn't let me stand up. Maybe it was a finality pressing down on my chest. This was the last word from Alistair Davies. The last fragment of a puzzle I'd never been allowed to assemble. Why did he send me away? Why did he sever every thread between us? He wasn't a monster. The memories I still carried, fractured, faded, worn soft at the edges, were of a kind man, calloused hands that smelled of sawdust and pine needles, a voice that was patient. A man who taught me how to skip stones on the river behind his small, cluttered house. That man did not fit inside the same story as the one who'd hand his only grandson to the state and vanish. __, quote, _, 11, __. My voice came out low, almost a whisper. Abernathy hesitated, a fraction of a second, barely visible. But in that silent, pressurized room, the pause landed like a gunshot. Quote 12, he said. His tone had softened. Quote 13. He said it was the only thing of value he had left to give. The way he placed his weight on that word, value, carried something heavier than money. I stood. The leather chair exhaled beneath me, relieved to be free of the tension. I tucked the envelope into the inside pocket of my ill-fitting suit jacket. Quote 14. I turned toward the door. His voice caught me before I reached the hallway. Quote 15. I looked back. Arthur Abernathy's face was unreadable, a professional mask held firmly in place. But his eyes, magnified, overexposed behind those thick lenses, told a different story entirely. Be careful, he said. Some histories are better left buried. The bus ride north was a slow, grinding extraction from the only life I knew. The city and its grid of familiar grey streets bled into suburbs. Suburbs frayed into farmland. Farmland dissolved into the dense, dark green of the Oregon wilderness. 14 hours. I watched the world slide past the glass, feeling like a ghost drifting along the margins of other people's lives. I had the $1,400, minus the bus ticket, sitting in a new bank account. A cheap burner phone Carol had given me as a parting gift, and the heavy envelope from my grandfather. I'd cracked it open somewhere around hour 3, the drone of the engine a fitting soundtrack to what waited inside. An old iron key, heavy, pitted with rust, and a folded piece of paper. Not a modern deed, nothing typed, nothing notarized. A hand-drawn map on thick yellowed parchment. A circle in red ink with an X at its center. Coordinates written in a careful hand. And beneath them, a single instruction, stark, simple, offering nothing beyond itself. The door is on the north face of the ridge. The key fits only one lock. Trust what you find. Burn the rest. Less an inheritance than the opening move of a scavenger hunt, one dreamed up by someone teetering on the edge of sanity. The bus carried almost nobody, a handful of solitary figures, each sealed inside their own silence. Temperature dropped as the road climbed, the sky pressed down, flat, colorless, merciless. I kept turning over what Abernathy had told me. Some histories are better left buried. What did that even mean? What kind of history could a carpenter have? The man I remembered built birdhouses on Sunday mornings. He fixed porches that sagged under their own tired weight. He was not a man who owned iron keys or kept buried secrets. Or maybe he was. The memories I carried were a child's memories, soft around the edges, distorted by emotion, unreliable as smoke. Maybe I never knew him. Not really. The iron key dug into my ribs through the thin fabric of my jacket. A second pulse. Steady. Insistent. 8 years inside the system had stripped me of illusions. I had learned not to reach for things that weren't there. Hope was exposure. Hope was a door you opened just wide enough for someone to slam it on your fingers. But that key weighed more than every lesson the system ever beat into me. Something small and stubborn was pushing through, a green shoot cracking dry earth inside my chest. For the first time since I was 10 years old, I had somewhere to go. A worthless scrap of land, a lock waiting for a key. It wasn't much, but it was a thread, thin, fraying, reaching back into a past that had been torn away from me with surgical violence. The bus shuddered to a stop at a crossroads marked by a single yellow light, blinking its slow, meaningless rhythm. The town, if that word even applied, was called Hemlock Creek. A gas station, a diner bleeding neon through a cracked sign, a general store with a Coca-Cola logo so faded it looked painted during a different century. The air hit me first. Sharp, clean, wet pine and dark soil. A smell I hadn't encountered in years, and it unlocked something I wasn't prepared for. A phantom sensation, a ghost limb of belonging that hadn't existed since childhood. My stomach clenched. Nostalgia and dread knotted together so tight I couldn't tell which was which. Inside the general store, I grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight, batteries, bottled water, a few protein bars. The man behind the register had a face like cracked leather, ancient, weathered, worn into a kind of permanent tired kindness. He asked, scanning my items. I set the map on the counter. His hands went still, eyes narrowed, just a fraction. I didn't answer right away. Then I unfolded the map and slid it toward him. He fished reading glasses from his shirt pocket, bent close, squinted. "Well, I'll be," he said, almost to himself. "That's old Davy's place. Nobody's gone out there in... Lord, must be near on 10 years. Alistair's boy, are you?" He said it easy, conversational. It landed like a fist against my sternum. "Grandson," I said. My voice came out tight, compressed. He's gone. The man's expression shifted. Something behind his eyes softened and settled. He turned and pointed through the window toward the tree line. I thanked him, paid, stepped back into the cold. 5 miles. It felt like 50. Pavement surrendered to gravel exactly when he said it would. Each footstep crunched loud in the silence, the only sound besides wind pushing through pines that rose on both sides like tall, mute witnesses. The sky was bruising, clouds swelling dark and heavy with rain they hadn't decided to release yet. I yanked my hood up, the jacket too thin for this, too thin for any of this, and walked faster. The dirt track gave out where the undergrowth began, a wall of green swallowing whatever path once existed. Cold drizzle needled my skin. I stood there staring at what my grandfather had left me. It wasn't land. It was a war zone of blackberry thorns, sword ferns, and young alder saplings choking one another beneath cathedral-tall Douglas firs. No structure, no foundation, no ruin, not even the ghost of a building. 5 acres of wild, hostile nothing. Exactly as worthless as Arthur Abernathy had warned. Despair hit me like a fist to the sternum. I'd burned every last dollar chasing this, every last scrap of hope, too. Standing there, soaked in that grey Oregon mist, I saw myself clearly. A lost kid with no home, no family, no safety net, playing make-believe with a dead man's map. I nearly turned around, nearly walked those 5 miles back to town and climbed on the first bus headed anywhere else. But I looked at the map one more time. North face of the ridge. The ridge wasn't hard to find. A steep, rocky spine of earth ran along the property's back edge like a clenched jaw. Its north face dropped away, sheer, slick with moss and rain. Impossible terrain. I spent the next hour clawing along its base, palms torn raw against wet stone, clothes plastered to my body. The rain thickened. Cold sank into my bones. Every handhold felt like a negotiation with gravity. I was seconds from quitting. Then my boot caught a soft patch. Earth gave way beneath my weight, sending a small avalanche of soil and rock skittering down the slope. And underneath, where the dirt and moss had torn free, I saw it. A flat grey corner. Not stone, concrete. My pulse slammed against the inside of my skull. I dropped to my knees, started clawing at the ground with bare hands, ripping through roots and packed soil like something feral. The cold stopped registering. The rain became invisible. I dug until my fingertips went numb, until blood mixed with the mud under my nails. What emerged was a large rectangular slab of poured concrete, set perfectly flush into the hillside, deliberately hidden, deliberately built, and at its center, a recessed steel door, heavy gauge, its surface buried beneath a crust of rust, so thick and dark it looked like dried blood. No handle anywhere, just one feature, a single keyhole, black as a pupil. It was real. Whatever this was, whatever Alistair Davis had sealed inside this hillside, it was real. My hands shook as I fished the iron key from my pocket. The weight of it felt different now. Not just metal. History. Intent. A message from a dead man who'd planned for this exact moment. I scraped mud from the keyhole with my thumbnail, slid the key in. It resisted, grating, grinding against decades of corrosion. I pushed harder, then it sank, all the way to the bow. Both hands around the shaft. I turned. Nothing. I leaned my full weight into it, shoulders burning, jaw clenched, every muscle screaming against rusted tumblers that hadn't moved in years. Then, deep inside the door, something surrendered. A groaning shudder rolled through the concrete like the earth itself was exhaling. A metallic clang split the forest open. Crows erupted from the fir canopy, black shapes scattering against grey sky. The sound echoed off the ridge and died slowly in the trees. Finality. Release. A thin breath of trapped air seeped from the door's edges. Musty. Ancient. The smell of things sealed away from time, dust and damp and secrets kept too long. I filled my lungs, braced both palms against the concrete frame. Pulled. The door was brutal, hundreds of pounds of steel fighting its own corrosion. It moved in inches, scraping against its frame with a tortured shriek that set my teeth on edge. Metal on metal. I hauled until the gap was just wide enough to squeeze my body through. The flashlight clicked on. Its beam punched a sharp white cone into absolute blackness. I stepped across the threshold, out of the rain, out of the drizzle and the cold Oregon air, and into whatever Alistair Davies had buried here. Inside, the air was dead, still as a held breath. It carried dust, damp concrete, and something else beneath those, the faint metallic tang. Old machinery, sleeping iron. The flashlight swept the space, concrete walls. And ahead, a short, steep set of steps descending into darkness so complete the beam couldn't find its bottom. I pulled the heavy door shut behind me. It sealed shut with a low, bone-deep boom that traveled up through the concrete and into the soles of my boots. Silence crashed in after it. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something heavier. A pressure that pushed against my eardrums, filled my skull, swallowed everything except the jagged rhythm of my own breathing. I was entombed. Pure animal panic hit me for one blinding second. What if the door wouldn't open from this side? My hands twitched towards the steps behind me. Every survival instinct I had screamed at me to scramble back up and test it. But I didn't. I stayed. Trust what you find. His words, my grandfather's words. I pulled one slow breath through my teeth, held it, and started down. The staircase emptied into a broad, square chamber. I dragged the flashlight beam across a space in a wide arc. My boots ground against dusty concrete with each step. What I saw stopped me cold. This was a military bunker. No other description fit. Walls of solid poured concrete. A ceiling braced with heavy steel I-beams. The kind of construction designed to survive what nothing above ground could. One entire wall was lined with shelving. Gas masks stuffed into canvas bags. Sealed tins that had to be rations, metal canteens, rows of jerry cans filled with water, all military surplus, all organized with a precision that felt deliberate, almost obsessive. In the far corner stood a narrow cot, a wool blanket folded tight across it. Beside the cot, a small wooden table, a single chair, nothing else. Spartan, functional, and preserved, like someone had set this room up and then sealed it with the expectation that years, maybe decades, would pass before another living person stepped inside. A tomb, a fallout shelter, a place built to outlast catastrophe. And my grandfather, the carpenter from Hemlock Creek, had constructed it beneath his property. What in God's name was he hiding from? What had he been so terrified of that he'd poured concrete walls underground and stocked them for the end of the world? The flashlight beam caught something under the cot, a large green metal footlocker, military issue, the only personal object in the entire room. No padlock. My fingers were still half numb from the cold, clumsy and stiff. I fumbled with the latches. They popped open with a sharp metallic snap that echoed off every wall. I heaved the lid up. Cedar and mothballs, the smell rolled out in a wave. Inside, folded with care, lay a set of old work clothes, a flannel shirt, denim overalls, worn soft at the knees. And beneath the cedar, beneath the mothballs, sawdust. Faint but unmistakable. The scent hit me like a fist to the sternum. That was him. That was my grandfather. Not a memory, not an idea. The smell my body recognized before my mind could catch up, and for a moment I couldn't breathe around it. Under the clothes, a small framed photograph. I lifted it out, wiped the grime from the glass with my thumb. A little boy, me, 5 or 6 years old, perched on a man's shoulders. Both of us squinting into the sun, both of us grinning so wide our faces barely held it. I didn't remember anyone taking that picture, but the feeling. I remembered the feeling, the height, the hands gripping my ankles so I wouldn't fall, the absolute certainty that nothing bad could reach me up there. Safe, on top of the world. Something hard and sharp lodged itself in my throat. At the very bottom of the footlocker, beneath everything else, I found what I'd come for. A stack of envelopes bound together with a piece of rough twine. Every one addressed to me in that same spidery, deliberate handwriting. A dozen at least. But one envelope sat on top, separated from the rest. A single word written across it. First. My hands shook so violently I nearly couldn't work the knot loose. I lowered myself onto the edge of the cot. The thin mattress springs groaned beneath me, a sound that seemed enormous in that dead, sealed air. The stillness down here was so total that when I tore the envelope open, the ripping paper cracked through the room like something breaking. I unfolded the letter, several pages. Every line dense with that tight, controlled script. Words pressed close together as though he'd been afraid of running out of room or running out of time. I steadied my hands against my knees, drew one more breath, and read. That was how it started. My eyes moved across the page. My heart slammed against my ribs like something caged and desperate to escape. The letters on the page started swimming. Cold from the concrete floor seeped through my jeans, deep into the bone. I couldn't move. Couldn't shift an inch, quote. I kept reading. Each sentence landed heavier than the last. I stopped. My chest had cinched tight like a belt pulled to its last notch. Breath came in thin, shallow pulls that barely reached my lungs. I remembered being watched. I told my grandfather once about a strange car. His face went white, drained of every drop of color in a single second. A mask of fear I was too young to decode. He told me it was nothing, just my imagination. I forced my eyes back to the page. My throat closed. The letter slipped from my fingers, fell to the concrete without a sound. One hot tear carved a path through the grime on my cheek, then another, then another. Then I broke. Great racking sobs ripped through my body. They echoed off the walls of that silent concrete tomb. Ugly, raw, animal sounds. The sound of 8 years of fury. 8 years of loneliness, so deep I had forgotten what its absence felt like. 8 years of a question I never dared ask out loud, because the answer I believed was too devastating to hear spoken. I wasn't abandoned. I was protected. In the most brutal, cruel, and selfless way a human being could protect another. I had been loved. I cried for the grandfather I had hated, for the man who had locked himself inside his own prison of grief just to keep me safe. I cried for the 10-year-old boy who thought his world had ended, the boy who learned to stack bricks around his heart so thick, so high, that nothing, not kindness, not warmth, not even hope, could find a way in. I cried until there was nothing left, until I was just a hollow, aching shell sitting on a cot in the dark. The truth of my past, stripped raw by words from a man already in the ground. When that storm of grief finally burned itself out, what remained wasn't emptiness. It was something stranger, a stillness I couldn't name. The bunker had shifted around me. No longer a grave, something else entirely. A vault of honesty, a place where lies couldn't breathe. I sat there in that underground silence for what might have been minutes or might have been hours. The flashlight was dimming. The earth pressed close on every side, heavy and patient. The letter lay crumpled on the concrete where it had slipped from my fingers. One paragraph remained, unread. I reached for it. My hands weren't shaking anymore. The final words hit different from everything that came before. This bunker is yours now, Leo. There are supplies here to last you for months. There is more information hidden away if you feel you need it, but you don't have to look for it. My fight does not have to be your fight. You are free. You can take what little money I left you and walk away. Start a new life. Forget about me and forget about Silas Croft. That is all I ever wanted for you, to be safe and to be free. Whatever you choose, know that I loved you. Know that every day I was proud of you. Your loving grandfather, Alistair. The choice he offered was surgical in its simplicity and brutal because of it. Walk away clean, or reach deeper into the dark and inherit a war that wasn't mine. 8 years I'd spent just trying to stay upright, keeping my head low, not making waves, not making noise. The rational move, the move any sane person would make, was to pocket whatever money he'd left and disappear. Honor his sacrifice by doing the one thing he begged me to do. Live free. Let him rest. But something wouldn't let me. Could I really turn my back knowing Silas Croft still drew breath? The man who'd stolen my childhood like it was inventory. The man who'd sentenced my grandfather to decades of solitary anguish, hiding, watching from a distance, loving a boy he could never touch. All that misdirected fury I'd carried for years, the rage I'd aimed at Alistair for abandoning me, it had a proper target now. Cold, dense, lodged deep in the pit of my stomach like a stone that wouldn't dissolve. It didn't want comfort, it wanted accountability. And then there was the other thing, the quieter thing. The part of me that had been starving for connection since before I could articulate what connection even meant. This story, his fight, his sacrifice, the trail he'd left, was the last living thread between us. Walking away from it would be abandoning him a second time, and I'd spent my whole life knowing what abandonment tasted like. I couldn't be the one to serve it. If you've ever stood at a crossroads, where the person you were simply could not continue forward, where the old version of you hit a wall, and the only path through required becoming someone new, then you understand what that moment felt like. Terrifying, electric. The past handing you a reason, the future demanding a decision. I want to pause here. If any piece of this story has brushed against something real inside you, something you carry, I'm grateful you're still listening. Hit subscribe if you want to be part of a community that gets it. People who've navigated the hard stuff. People who've had to dig for their own truth beneath years of buried pain. That means something. Genuinely. Now, back to that bunker. Because the choice I made down there wasn't just about yesterday. It was about every tomorrow I'd ever have. I folded the letter with care, slid it back into the envelope, pressed the crease flat with my thumb. I would not walk away. The option existed, and I refused it. I owed him that. I owed it to the 10-year-old boy who never got a proper goodbye, who stood at a window waiting for a man who couldn't come. I needed the rest of the story. Every last fragment. I needed to see this thing through to its end. His fight was my fight now. The letter said more information was hidden somewhere in this room. I stood, my knees cracked, my back ached from the cold concrete and from hours of sitting folded over grief. I took the weakening flashlight and began to search, methodical, deliberate. I started with the shelves, tapping the wall behind each one, listening for hollow spots. I pulled down tins of food, checked for false bottoms, turned them over in my hands. Nothing. I moved to the cot, lifted the thin mattress, ran my fingers along every welt of the metal frame, feeling for seams that shouldn't be there. Still nothing. Inch by inch I went over that room, every surface, every corner, every shadow the flashlight could reach, frustration climbing with each empty discovery. Where would a man like my grandfather hide something that mattered? A practical man, a careful man. He would tuck it somewhere obvious enough to be overlooked, or somewhere so unlikely that no one would waste a second glance. My gaze drifted downward. The floor was a single pour of concrete, solid, featureless. But beneath the cot, right where the footlocker had sat, the surface looked different. I dropped to my knees, ran my palm across it. A seam, barely visible. A hairline fracture tracing a perfect square, 2 feet by 2 feet. I pressed one edge. Nothing. I pulled the iron key from my pocket, the only tool on me, and worked its tip into that crack. Pried upward. The concrete shifted with a low, grinding protest. A panel. A lid. I got my fingers beneath it and heaved. Heavy, but it gave. Underneath lay a small, dark cavity, and nestled inside that cavity, another box, steel this time, the kind meant for documents and cash. No lock, just sitting there, just waiting. I pulled it free, far heavier than its size suggested. I carried it to the table, set it down. My pulse had gone thick and slow, a deep drumbeat filling the silence of that bunker. One breath, then I opened it. The contents emptied my lungs. Cash. The top layer was nothing but cash. Stack after stack of $100 bills, each bundle held by a plain rubber band. I didn't count it. Tens of thousands at least, maybe far more. A fortune. Enough to vanish. Enough to live quietly for a very long time. The escape he had promised me. But underneath all that money sat something worth infinitely more. A thick, leather-bound ledger. And another envelope, sealed with the same wax stamp as the one Arthur Abernethy had placed in my hands. I reached for the letter first. The handwriting was the same. The tone was not. This was no longer a grieving grandfather speaking. This was a man bracing for war. "Leo," it began, "if you have found this, you have chosen not to run. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry this has fallen to you. But I am also proud. This is the choice I could never make. The money is yours, no matter what. Use it to protect yourself. But this ledger, this is the weapon. It contains everything. Every illegal transaction, every bribe, every threat Silas Croft ever made. It is my confession and his conviction, all in one. I was his bookkeeper in the beginning. I saw it all. It's all in there. The names, the dates, the accounts. It is the truth. For years, Croft has been trying to acquire all the land on this ridge for a luxury resort development. He has bullied and bankrupted every family here. My 5 acres are the last holdout. 5 acres of worthless rock. The linchpin in a multi-million-dollar plan. Silas Croft believed that with my grandfather gone, the land would fall to him like ripe fruit. He didn't know about me. The letter continued, methodical, precise, detailing exactly what the ledger held. How to decipher the codes Alistair Davies had devised. A meticulous accounting of a criminal empire, rendered in a carpenter's steady hand. Then came the final lines. Not a farewell, a charge, a torch pressed into the hands of the next runner. You have 2 choices, son. Take the money and the ledger and disappear. He will never find you. Or take this to Arthur Abernethy. He was my only friend, the only one I trusted. He will know what to do. The choice is yours. Avenge me or live for me. Either way, be safe. I closed my eyes. The ledger sat in my lap like a stone pulled from the earth's core. A book of sins, my grandfather's and Croft's, bound together in the same leather. It was a heavy inheritance. Right in the middle of all that weight, the letters, the truth, the enormity pressing down on my chest, a sound ripped through the silence like a blade. Sharp, foreign, wrong for this place. It took my brain a second to catch up. My phone. That cheap burner rattling in my pocket, its tinny ringtone obscene against the stillness of this underground tomb. I dug it out with clumsy fingers and answered. "Hello, Leo. It's Arthur Abernethy." Gone was the measured detachment. Gone was the dry, careful lawyer. His voice cut like wire, tight, urgent, stripped of everything polite. "I'm glad I reached you. We have a problem, a big one." "What is it?" My own words came out hollow, like they belonged to someone standing 10 feet behind me, watching all of this happen to somebody else. A development firm, Croft Enterprises, had just filed an accelerated foreclosure claim against my grandfather's property. That's what Abernethy told me. The words came rapid and blunt, no pauses, no softening. They'd produced a promissory note, supposedly signed by Alistair, supposedly securing a massive debt against the land. They claimed he'd defaulted. The note looked legitimate on its face, but Abernethy knew Alistair. Knew he would never have been that reckless. It had to be a forgery. That wasn't the worst part. The worst part was they had a judge willing to play along. An expedited hearing had already been granted. 48 hours to file a formal response, or the court would hand them the title outright. They were trying to steal it, and they were doing it at a dead sprint. Silas Croft. Not a name buried in faded ink anymore. Not a phantom from a dead man's ladder. Real, moving. Making his play before the dirt on my grandfather's grave had settled. Alistair had been gone less than a week, and his enemy was already clawing at the gate. The timing was surgical, deliberate. Croft had been circling, patient as a vulture, waiting for my grandfather to die. He assumed the property would drift into tangled probate, easy pickings, pennies on the dollar, no one left to fight. He never accounted for me, never imagined the bunker, never suspected the letters, the evidence, the ledger that sat open across my knees right now, heavy with decades of meticulously documented truth. The world above had kept turning while I'd been sitting underground, swallowed by the past. Now the past was crashing headlong into the present, and the present demanded an answer. "Leo, are you there?" Abernethy's voice, strained, barely holding. __quote _41 __. I looked down at the ledger, looked at the stacks of cash, heard my grandfather's words echoing off the concrete walls of my skull. Avenge me, or live for me. There was no choice anymore. Croft had erased it. He wasn't just coming for dirt and timber, he was coming for my grandfather's memory. Coming to bulldoze the last trace of Alistair Davis off the face of the earth and pour a resort foundation over his bones. Something shifted inside me then. Cold, precise. The fear didn't fade, it burned away, replaced by a resolve so hard I could feel it in my jaw, in my fists, in the rigid line of my spine. I was not a scared kid drifting through a system that never wanted him. Not anymore. I was Alistair Davis' grandson, and this was my land. "I hear you, Mr. Abernethy." My voice had changed. I could hear it myself, steady, low, calm in a way that had nothing to do with peace and everything to do with certainty. "I think I have something you need to see, something that's going to stop Mr. Croft for good." The next 48 hours collapsed into a single unbroken current of motion and purpose. I hiked back toward Hemlock Creek with a steel box sealed inside my duffel bag. The cash pressed against my spine, a startling physical weight reminding me with every step that this was real. I was not the same aimless kid who had shuffled down this road less than a day ago. That version of me didn't have a mission. This one did. I caught the first bus heading back towards the city. My mind wouldn't stop, spinning, sorting, planning. Abernethy had told me to call him from a secure line. I didn't feed him details over the phone, just told him I'd found what my grandfather left behind. He said, "Come straight to the office." Didn't matter what hour. I reached his building deep into the night. The city blazed around me, all that electric noise, all those lights. But it felt like scenery painted on glass, thin, unreal. The only things that were solid, the only things that mattered, were the bunker, the letters, and the crushing weight of that ledger pressed against my back. Abernethy met me at a private entrance, let me in himself. The office sat in near darkness, a single desk lamp throwing long shadows across every wall. He looked worn down, exhausted. But those eyes were razor wire. __quote _44 ___. His voice barely above a murmur. I didn't answer him. I unzipped the duffel right there on his desk, pulled out the steel box, cracked it open, laid the ledger flat on that polished mahogany surface. He stared at it, a long, stretched-out moment where neither of us breathed. His expression, I couldn't read it. Then his hand reached out, trembling, fingertips brushing the worn leather cover like it might dissolve at his touch. 45, he whispered. Not to me, to the room, to the ghost of my grandfather. 46. He lifted his gaze to mine, and something broke open in him. The professional mask, the careful, measured face of a man who'd spent a lifetime in courtrooms, it just fell away. What lived underneath was grief, raw grief, and a loyalty so fierce it had teeth. Your grandfather was my best friend, Leo. He saved my life once, a long time ago. I owed him a debt I could never repay. His voice cracked on the next words. Helping you. Maybe this is how I finally do it. We didn't leave that office. The entire night bled away while we hunched over the ledger together, Abernathy translating my grandfather's coded entries line by painstaking line. And it was all there, every rotten piece of it. A full decade of crime, documented with a carpenter's precision. Bribes funneled to county officials, extortion records running like clockwork, fraudulent loan applications stacked deep enough to bury a man. This wasn't just enough to bring down Silas Croft. This was enough to collapse half the local government with him. Dawn crept in, pale grey light pressing through the office windows, and Abernathy finally closed the book, set both palms flat on its cover. This is it, he said, grim satisfaction carved into every syllable. This is more than enough. He copied the most damning pages. Then he picked up the phone and called a contact at the state attorney's office. A man who owed him a favor. A man who despised corruption the way some people despise cowardice. And the wheels of justice, rusted stiff, seized up for years, began to grind forward. The day of the hearing, I sat in the back row of the courtroom. Abernathy had insisted on it. Stay out of sight, stay small. Silas Croft was already there, silver-haired, handsome, an expensive suit draped over him like armor. He was smiling at his lawyers, relaxed, confident. He looked exactly like a pillar of the community, not a monster. He didn't scan the room, didn't glance my direction even once. I was nobody to him, a ghost he'd never bothered to see. The judge called the case. Croft's lawyer rose and presented the forged promissory note with a flourish, polished, official, airtight. It felt insurmountable sitting there watching it. Then Abernathy stood. He didn't address the note, didn't even acknowledge it. He simply said, quote, one thick file, placed on the judge's bench. Silence swallowed the courtroom as the judge began to read. I kept my eyes locked on Croft's face. The confident smile, it didn't vanish all at once. It faltered, twitched. His gaze darted from the judge to Abernathy and back again. Confusion first, then something sharper, alarm. The judge's face went pale. He looked up, not at the lawyers, at two men in dark suits who had slipped quietly through the rear doors. State investigators. They moved down the aisle with the calm, unhurried pace of people who know exactly what comes next. They approached Silas Croft. One leaned in close, spoke something directly into his ear. The color left Croft's face like water draining from a sink. The pillar crumbled. The monster stood exposed. And it was all so quiet, so terribly civil. No shouting, no dramatic scene. Just the methodical, surgical dismantling of a man who'd built his empire on other people's silence. They walked him out of that courtroom, and his expensive suit, the one that had looked so commanding minutes before, suddenly hung cheap and ill-fitting on his frame. Case dismissed. The land was mine. Free and clear. No liens, no claims, no shadows hanging over it. The war was over. Won. In the weeks that followed, the whole story unspooled across the local papers. Croft's empire had been nothing but a house of cards, held together by intimidation and fabricated paper. My grandfather's ledger was the wind that scattered every last one. Once the arrest hit the news, other people found their courage. They stepped forward with accounts of their own. Coercion, fraud, stolen land. It became an avalanche no attorney could outrun. I used a portion of the money my grandfather had set aside to pay Arthur Abernethy for everything he'd done. He tried to wave it off, refused twice. I insisted. The rest went into a savings account. Not a fortune, but a floor beneath my feet. A safety net I had never once possessed in my entire life. But the real inheritance was never the money. It was the land. It was that bunker buried in the hillside. It was 5 acres of northern Oregon dirt that had my family's name written into its roots. I went back to Hemlock Creek, bought a used pickup with cash, loaded the bed with tools and supplies, and I started working. Every morning, dawn to dark, I was out on that parcel with a machete and a pair of work gloves, hacking back years of overgrown brush. Brambles thick as my wrist, saplings that had choked the clearings. I cut them down and dragged them to burn piles, and as the canopy thinned, sunlight hit the forest floor for the first time in what must have been a decade. The earth beneath was dark and rich, alive. I worked with my hands the way he had, sawing, hauling, stacking. My palms blistered, and the blisters broke and hardened into calluses that felt like they belonged there. One afternoon, I found the foundation of his old house, the one from my earliest memories, the one I could barely hold in my mind without it dissolving like smoke. Concrete footings, a cracked slab, the ghost of a front step. I stood over it for a long time, and somewhere in that silence the idea took shape. I was going to rebuild it. The bunker was no longer a dark, sealed secret. I aired it out over 3 full days, propped the hatch, ran a battery fan, let the mustiness drain from every corner. Then I scrubbed it from ceiling to floor, walls, shelves, the cold concrete under my knees. It was my history now, my sanctuary. I left the cot where it was, left the table too. They stayed as a quiet memorial to the man who had spent so many lonely years down there in the half-light, protecting a grandson who didn't even know he existed. Some evenings I would climb down and sit in that profound silence. No wind, no birdsong, just the hum of the earth itself. And I would read his other letters, the ones that had nothing to do with Silas Croft. They were about me. He had written one for every birthday he missed, each envelope dated in his careful hand, each letter imagining what I might be doing that year, what kind of boy I was becoming, what kind of man. He wrote about his pride, how he pictured me figuring things out on my own, because Davy's men always did. He wrote about his regret, the holidays, the school plays, the skinned knees he wasn't there to bandage, and threaded through every page, every line, every smudged word where the pen had paused too long, his unending love. He had never been gone, not really. He had been with me the whole time. Watching from a distance I couldn't fathom, his laugh a shield I never knew I carried. One morning, the old man from the general store drove his truck up the newly cleared track to the property, gravel popping under his tires. He climbed out slow, the way old men do when their knees have opinions, and he was holding a thermos. He said, handed me a steaming cup of coffee without ceremony. We stood there together for a while, neither of us talking, just looking out over the ridge where the tree line met the sky in a ragged, dark seam. The store owner said quietly. A pause. A lump swelled in my throat so fast I had to look away. I know, I said. I finally know. I wasn't a ward of the state anymore. I wasn't a case file, wasn't a statistic, wasn't a number on a social worker's caseload that aged out and disappeared into the margins. I was Leo Davis, son of this land, grandson of a man who moved heaven and earth, then buried himself beneath it to keep me safe. My story was never about abandonment. I just hadn't read far enough to understand that. It was a story of sacrifice, of a love so fierce it was willing to be hated rather than expose the person it existed to protect. It was a story of coming home to a place I didn't know was waiting for me. My grandfather left me with a choice: run from the past or build a future on its foundation. I chose to build. And standing here today, on this ground that carries my name, I feel a peace I never believed was meant for someone like me. The past doesn't have to be a prison. It can be a blueprint. It can be the solid, unshakable ground beneath your feet, if you're willing to dig down to it. So I want to ask you something. What foundation are you building on? What pieces of your own history have you had to reclaim, fight for, grieve over, rewrite, to become who you are today? If this story reached something in you, if you've ever had to claw your way toward your own truth when every system and every silence conspired to keep it buried, I'd be honored if you shared a piece of your journey in the comments below. Your stories matter here. This is a place for people who understand that the deepest roots grow in the hardest ground. Thank you for listening, and if you haven't already, please subscribe and be part of this conversation. Because every one of us deserves a place to call home.